All right, ladies and gentlemen. So this is our timeline of the Holocaust, and this is the short version. We're going to do a longer version, but this is just a brief introduction to the Holocaust. And so we're going to start with, here's an image of Elie Wiesel. He is the author of the text. His name, Elie, is short for Eliezer, but Elie was the name that he went by as a child and continued to go by throughout his life. All right, as I said, this is our short and sweet timeline. We're just going to go through the basics of what led up to the war, the war itself, and then post World War II. And then we'll get into more detail as we go in the latter timeline. Your job is going to be to, as you're watching this video, stop momentarily and answer some questions just to make sure that you're absorbing the information that is being provided for you. So we'll go ahead and get started here with the pre-war portion. Now, there are a lot of places that we could say this war starts, that World War II starts, where the Holocaust starts. But really, we just kind of have to give it a point somewhere. And for the purposes of this timeline, I'm going to state that World War II, or the Holocaust, really gets its start when World War I ends. And that's kind of what leads up to it. We could definitely go back farther than that if we'd like. But really, in 1919, the Versailles Treaty ends World War I. Now, that sounds like great. The conflict's been resolved. There will be peace. But the problem with the Versailles Treaty is, here is the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and a newspaper cover there. Is the problem with the Treaty of Versailles is Germany gets the blame for World War I. And so they take the blame for it in this treaty, and they are being forced to pay reparations as well, meaning that the world expects Germany to pay the world back for fighting World War I. Well, the problem is when you have a country that has just lost a war, they're going to be economically devastated. And then on top of that, you're going to force them to pay other countries to rebuild after the war. That means the money that they do have can't go into rebuilding their own country. So the people of Germany are poor and getting more bitter as time goes on because they're seeing their money leaving their country rather than helping to rebuild. So in 1923, we have the worst year of the struggling German economy. So they're struggling. It's rough. But on top of that, what they're seeing is media from around the world, particularly the United States. And in 1923, that's the era known as the Roaring Twenties in the United States. This is a time of great wealth. Now, not everybody in the 20s in America was rich, but everybody on screen in the 20s in America and everybody in magazines in the 20s in America were rich. And that's what was getting exported to Germany. So whenever they see Americans, they're seeing them singing and dancing and partying in these giant mansions in these beautiful gowns and tuxedos and that sort of thing. And that was kind of the film style of the time. And Germany's just getting more and more angry about it. But then in 1929, the United States stock market crashes. This is where the stock market crash that leads to the Great Depression. Now, one would think that Germany would be happy to see this. Great, America's finally going to see what we've been suffering like. But the problem is the United States stock market crash actually impacts everyone in the world and leads Germany to fall into an even deeper depression, economic depression. All right, so it doesn't help Germany at all. All right, and so we have this, the stock market crash. We have the panic in the stock market. We have widespread unemployment. This is a comic in a newspaper depicting the suicides of businessmen who went from being extremely wealthy to dead broke in the matter of one day. And there were mass suicides happening in big cities like New York and Chicago during this time. All right. So in 1932, the Nazis become the largest party in German parliament. So we have this Nazi party, this political party that starts to rise up in Germany. And they promise to bring Germany out of their funk and back to greatness. And I'm saying this without any political commentary or any of that. But the Nazi Party's platform was to make Germany great again. That was their argument, is that they were going to bring Germany back to the power that it was prior to World War I. All right, then we have this rise of Hitler. So we're still in that pre-war time, but this is where Hitler starts to gain power. So in 1933, he's made chancellor or the prime minister of Germany. And once he's made the prime minister, he immediately starts to take away the constitutional rights of Jewish people. And then he also immediately starts to open up these concentration camps, which were originally thought to be prisons for political prisoners and work camps for people who spoke out against the government. It wasn't until later that they started to see the true use for those. Now, there was a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses that happened in 1933 as well. So you have the government kind of turning against these Jewish-owned businesses. All right. Hitler was well known for being an outstanding public speaker. He could get a crowd riled up. He was fantastic at this. He was manipulating. He was enigmatic. People wanted to hear him speak because he was so enthusiastic in his speech. His speeches were just mesmerizing. Right? And so if you are unaware of what Hitler looked like, this is Hitler. This is him looking out over the military, the Nazi or the German military at one of his military parades. All right. So in 1934, Hitler becomes the supreme leader and total master of Germany. So before we go there, so Hitler becomes the supreme leader of Germany. I'm going to take a pause here for just a moment. All right, so Hitler becomes the supreme leader, the total master of Germany. Now, how this works is, as he is chancellor, he says to the people, Germany's government was notorious for the bureaucracy. There was so much paperwork to be filed for anything to be done, and so many people that you had to go through to get anything to pass. And so Hitler said to the government, listen, if there is a time of war, there's going to be a problem. We're not going to be able to react fast enough because of this bureaucracy. So what do you say that if there is a state of emergency, then I become supreme leader? I'm in charge, and what I say goes. And then once the emergency is over, the power will revert back to the people. Now, the government knew how bad their bureaucracy was and how slow it was. So they said, Hitler, okay, if there is a state of emergency, but only if there is a state of emergency, then all power will be granted to you. And then once that's over, you will return the power to the government. And so they agreed to Hitler's suggestion, and immediately Hitler, as chancellor, declared a state of emergency. thus taking over the power of Germany. So he had the right as chancellor to declare a state of emergency. He declared the state of emergency and took control. If this sounds familiar to some of you, if you are a fan of Star Wars, that's exactly how the Emperor took over and began the empire in the Star Wars movies, was in this same method. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, is a huge fan of World War II history, so he kind of based that on this. All right, so in 1935, Germany passes anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws. Now, these are laws that define what it is to be a Jew and what it is not to be. And so this is how they measured Jewishness of people. All right. In 1936, the Olympic Games were held in Berlin. And this was supposed to be a demonstration of white supremacy and the Aryan race, as Hitler spoke of the tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed men of Germany, the powerhouses of Germany. The Olympics were there to be his demonstration of that. Now, holding the Olympics in Berlin was a gift from the world to try to help Germany to get more wealth. So the Olympics used to bring in a lot of wealth to the countries that hosted it. And so the world was trying to help them out and also to kind of calm Hitler down because they knew that he could cause issues. All right. The problem was, well, not really a problem. Jesse Owens ended up winning 4 gold medals and set records in the Olympics. So this is Jesse Owens here, and he looked straight into Hitler's eyes when he stood on the platform earning his first place medal. And it kind of made Hitler look like a fool when he was talking about his master race. All right, then in 1938, this is where things really start to come out into the open. We have what was known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, and there were riots in the streets. Nazi men breaking into Jewish businesses, causing all kinds of damage, and then in 1938, we also have the Nations at Evian, that this is where German Jews were no longer allowed to leave the country. So at that point, if they had not left, they were now kind of trapped. And then Jewish children were expelled from public schools. And this is where Aryanization begins in earnest. And this is the getting rid of anyone who is not considered Aryan. Then we get into World War II. And World War II, we'll get into a few more details of this later. This is what we think of as 6 years of terror. Germany invades Czechoslovakia, and that's what begins World War II. And at this point, we start to see mass transportation of Jewish and other undesirable people being transported to ghettos. Now, ghettos are walled off sections of cities. Usually it's the poorest areas of town. They get everybody who is not Jewish out of that area. They wall it off. They put anyone who is undesirable, any Jewish people, back in. They cram them into these ghettos. And then the people who were displaced or moved out, they get their pick of Jewish people's homes. So the Jewish people lose their property and their livelihoods. In 1941, we see this is where all German Jews must wear a yellow star to symbolize who they are. If they're not wearing it, if it is covered up, they're risking their lives. They have to wear that out in the open. And then we see these mobile killing squads that attack and kill Jewish people at random. We start to see major deportations. So we're seeing Jewish people and other undesirables. Remember that term. We'll talk more about that later. Being deported to concentration camps. And then we see the Wannsee Conference, which agrees to the final solution. And the final solution is this term that we use for it's the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish problem, as they put it. And that final solution are these concentration camps, going from concentration prison camps to extermination camps. here is that yellow star that they were forced to wear. And they would have that stitched on their coats or in warmer weather, their shirts, and they had to wear those. In 1942, we see the first death camps begin to mass murder Jews. So these are the concentration camps or sections of them for these mass murders. And then in 1944, the Allied powers invade Western Europe in D-Day. Now remember, this is the short description. There's a lot of stuff going on here we'll talk about in our long form timeline. And this is these are some images of D-Day, and if you're a fan of war movies, you're probably familiar with this. But this is where we have the D-Day invasion into Germany. Well, not exactly, into Western Europe. Okay. And then 1945, as the camps are liberated, we have the survivors of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, and Buchenwald being liberated. When Hitler sees that he has lost the war, he commits suicide, and that essentially leads to the end of World War II in Europe. Now, there's still more going on in the Pacific at that time, because when the Nazis lost the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific was still continuing on. So here we have some liberated prisoners and some soldiers, Russian soldiers, liberating some prisoners from these concentration camps. Now, after the war is over, we have the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And so these trials are kind of, they're trials for these war criminals, but this is also the end of the war. We're seeing the treaties. It's similar to the Treaty of Versailles, and it is more fair. The world realized that they were not helping themselves by punishing Germany more than it had already been punished by losing the war. And so they did not force those reparations like they did with the Treaty of Versailles. And in 1948, the State of Israel was formed. Now, this was formed as a kind of to give back to the Jewish people who had suffered so much. They gave them the State of Israel, allowing them to live in peace from that point forward, so they weren't dependent on these other countries that might persecute them. Of course, if you are familiar with the history of the State of Israel, this didn't exactly work out because there were other people there that claimed it as their own, that land as their own birthright. And so you've had the struggle between the State of Israel and the Palestinians ever since that time. But essentially, this is our short timeline for the war. And as I said, we'll get into the long timeline soon.